The funeral had ended less than 20 minutes earlier when my brother-in-law decided grief could wait. We had barely taken our seats inside the attorney's conference room when Ethan pushed back his chair, so hard it scraped across the hardwood floor. "Before we waste everyone's time," he announced, folding his arms with a confident smile, "let's acknowledge what's obvious. The investments and the $4.2 million estate belong to my wife. She's the eldest child." The room fell silent. My younger sister, Vanessa, blinked at him in surprise. A few cousins immediately smiled and congratulated her. An aunt reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'm sure your mother would have wanted you to take charge," someone said. Across the table, every sympathetic glance shifted toward me. Poor Flora. The daughter who had spent years caring for our mother. The daughter who, apparently, had just lost everything. Ethan looked directly at me. "I hope there won't be any unnecessary arguments," he said. "Let's respect Margaret's wishes." There was only one problem. The attorney hadn't even opened the estate file. I looked at him. He looked back at me. For one completely unexpected moment. We both started laughing. Ethan's smile disappeared. "What exactly is so funny?" he demanded. The laughter wasn't cruel. It wasn't even planned. It was simply impossible to stop. Because Ethan had just made the biggest mistake of his life without realizing it. My name is Flora Bennett. I'm 41 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed my family understood the difference between confidence and truth. My mother had passed away after a long illness. Losing her was painful enough. For nearly 4 years, I had rearranged my career, spent countless nights driving her to specialists, managed her medications, organized every appointment, and helped her keep her independence as long as possible. I never asked what I would receive after she was gone. She often told me, "You'll understand why everything is organized this way one day." I always assumed she meant the paperwork would simply make things easier. I had no idea those words were about to protect our entire family. Vanessa wasn't a greedy person. She looked almost embarrassed by Ethan's announcement, but she didn't contradict him either. She simply stared at him, as though trying to understand why he'd spoken before anyone else. Ethan, however, acted like the meeting was already over. He leaned against the conference table and said, "There's really no need to read every page. Mom knew the oldest child should carry the responsibility. That's how families work." Several relatives nodded. Others avoided looking at me altogether. I noticed something none of them seemed to notice. The thick estate binder was still closed. Its security seal hadn't even been broken. Attorney Richard Lawson rested one hand on the binder without opening it. His expression remained calm, almost amused. Then he slowly turned toward me again. That was when Ethan slammed his palm onto the table. "If anyone has an objection," he snapped, "say it now." Before I could answer, Mr. Lawson quietly adjusted his glasses and said, "I think we've skipped over one very important fact." No one spoke for several long seconds. The attorney didn't rush to answer Ethan's demand. Instead, he calmly gathered the unopened folders into a neat stack and closed his legal pad. "I think," he said evenly, "everyone has had a difficult morning. Why don't we take 10 minutes before we begin?" Ethan frowned. "There's nothing to discuss." Mr. Lawson met his eyes without raising his voice. "There is, Mr. Collins, but we'll discuss it after everyone has had a chance to settle." He stood, carrying the estate binder with him into the adjoining office. The room slowly emptied as relatives drifted toward the hallway for coffee and bottled water. I remained by the conference table, staring at the framed photograph of my mother that someone had placed beside a vase of white lilies. It still felt impossible that she was gone. "Flora." I turned. Vanessa stood a few feet away, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "Can we talk?" I nodded. We stepped into the quiet hallway outside the conference room. She lowered her voice. "Why were you laughing?" There wasn't any accusation in her question. Only confusion. "I wasn't laughing at you," I said gently. "Then what?" I hesitated before answering. "I was laughing because Ethan sounded completely certain about something Mom explained years ago. Vanessa frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I sighed, "he believes one thing determines the estate." "The oldest child." I nodded. "Yes." She stared at me. "He told me that's how inheritances work. He said Mom wanted everything handled that way." He sounded so sure. I couldn't help shaking my head. Our mother never trusted assumptions. Vanessa looked even more confused. Then why would Ethan say it in front of everyone? I honestly don't know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence brought back memories I hadn't expected. Hospital waiting rooms. Prescription lists taped to my refrigerator. Weekend grocery trips, where Mom insisted she could still push the cart herself. Late-night phone calls after she'd forgotten whether she'd taken her medication. I remembered helping her sort bank statements across her dining room table while she carefully labeled folders in perfect handwriting. One afternoon, she'd looked at me over her reading glasses. "Families don't always fight because they're greedy," she'd said. "Sometimes they fight because someone thinks they understand something they never bothered to read." At the time, I'd assumed she was talking generally. Now her words echoed differently. Vanessa interrupted my thoughts. "You were with Mom during all of that, weren't you?" I smiled sadly. "Most of it. I didn't realize how much. You had your own family. And Ethan." I chose my words carefully. "He visited." That was all I said. Because the truth didn't need embellishment. He stopped by on birthdays, holiday dinners, the occasional Sunday afternoon. But when Mom needed someone to drive her to chemotherapy appointments, someone to sit through meetings with financial advisors, someone to organize insurance paperwork, he was always busy. Mom never complained. She simply adjusted. Vanessa looked down. "I didn't know." "I know." Before she could ask another question, Ethan appeared at the end of the hallway. "There you are." His voice carried enough authority that several relatives looked over. He walked directly between us. "What are we discussing?" Vanessa answered first. "Nothing." He looked at me instead. "I hope you're not trying to confuse her." "I'm answering her questions." "What questions?" "The ones she asked." His jaw tightened. "There won't be any misunderstandings once the attorney starts reading." I held his gaze. "I agree." For the first time since the funeral, uncertainty flickered across his face. Only for a second. Then it disappeared beneath another confident smile. He slipped an arm around Vanessa's shoulders. "Come on," he said. "Everyone already knows what's happening." As they walked back toward the conference room, Ethan stopped beside two of my cousins. "So," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Vanessa will probably need help managing the properties after everything transfers." One cousin nodded. Another glanced at me with visible pity. Someone whispered, "I feel bad for Flora." Another replied, "I guess their mother made her choice." I realized, with a sinking feeling, that Ethan's confidence was becoming evidence in everyone's mind. No documents. No signatures. No proof. Just certainty spoken loudly enough. For years, I'd stayed quiet because I believed keeping peace mattered more than correcting every misunderstanding. Today, that silence was allowing a lie to spread through my own family. As the attorney reopened the conference room door and invited everyone inside, I followed the others back to the table. But one question refused to leave my mind. What exactly had convinced Ethan he couldn't possibly be wrong? The moment everyone returned to the conference room, Ethan didn't wait for the attorney to take his seat. Instead, he stood again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with an easy smile, "before we get buried in legal language, I'd like everyone to know that Vanessa and I intend to honor Mom's legacy." The attorney paused beside his chair, but said nothing. Ethan took that silence as permission. "We'll keep the investment portfolio intact for now," he continued. "The lake house will probably be sold, The downtown commercial property isn't worth keeping, and we'll have to review the family trust before deciding who receives distributions. A murmur spread across the room. One uncle raised his hand. So, you're already in charge? Ethan nodded confidently. That's correct. Another relative smiled. Congratulations. Vanessa forced a weak smile, but didn't respond. She looked less like someone celebrating an inheritance and more like someone trying to understand how she had suddenly become responsible for millions of dollars. I watched her closely. She hadn't agreed with Ethan once. She simply wasn't stopping him. Then the questions began. What happens to the rental income? Will the investment stay with the same advisors? Will family heirlooms be divided? Ethan answered every question without hesitation. Oh, we'll review all of that. I'll make sure everything is handled efficiently. I've already been thinking about the best strategy. He spoke as though the estate already belonged to him. The attorney still hadn't opened a single page. Finally, Ethan turned toward me. And Flora. Every conversation stopped. He folded his arms. I know this may be disappointing. I said nothing. But let's be honest. He smiled, though there wasn't any kindness in it. You stayed so close to Margaret because you expected to be rewarded. The words landed like a slap. Several relatives looked down at the table. Others looked at me, waiting. Ethan wasn't finished. You practically managed her entire life. He shrugged. Maybe you thought that guaranteed a bigger inheritance. No, I replied quietly. He laughed. Come on. You expect everyone to believe you spent years handling appointments, bills, insurance paperwork, and finances without expecting something in return. I did it because she was my mother. His smile widened. Convenient answer. The room grew painfully quiet. I saw my aunt shift uncomfortably. One cousin slowly shook his head. Another avoided looking at me altogether. Vanessa finally spoke. Ethan. He raised a hand without looking at her. Not now. She fell silent again. Mr. Lawson gently closed the notebook he'd been writing in. Mr. Collins. Ethan turned confidently. Yes. I believe it's time we begin with the documents. He finally broke the seal on the estate binder. The crisp sound echoed through the room. Page after page was arranged with colored tabs and handwritten notes from my mother. The attorney adjusted his glasses. I'd like to clarify one matter before we proceed. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Go ahead. The trust never refers to an eldest child. The room became still. It identifies every beneficiary individually by full legal name. Ethan frowned. So, it also assigns separate fiduciary responsibilities. He tapped one section. Those responsibilities are entirely different from ownership. Ethan waved dismissively. That's legal wording. It changes nothing. He leaned forward again. My wife still controls the estate. A few relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Someone whispered. I thought he said birth order decided everything. Another quietly replied. Then why would everyone be listed by name? The certainty that had filled the room only minutes earlier began to crack. Vanessa looked toward the attorney. May I see what you're reading? Before Ethan could answer for her, Mr. Lawson nodded. Of course. He reached for the thick original trust binder. Ethan extended his hand first. I'll take it. The attorney didn't even look at him. Instead, he stood, walked around the table, and placed the original estate binder directly in front of me. Every eye in the room followed it. Ethan's confident smile vanished. Ethan stared at the thick binder sitting in front of me as though it had been placed in the wrong seat. His expression hardened. There must be some mistake. Mr. Lawson remained standing. There isn't. Ethan pushed his chair back. Then, why are you giving the estate documents to Flora instead of Vanessa? Several relatives nodded, waiting for the answer. The attorney rested one hand on the binder. Because Mrs. Bennet has already reviewed the structure of this trust with her late mother during several planning meetings. The room went silent again. Ethan blinked. What planning meetings? I answered before the attorney could. The ones Mom asked me to attend over the last 3 years. He looked at me as if I'd admitted to something dishonest. You never mentioned that. You never asked. He scoffed. So you've been preparing this behind everyone's backs? No. I kept my voice calm. Mom invited me because she wanted someone present while she discussed her wishes with her attorney and financial advisors. Mr. Lawson nodded. That is correct. Ethan folded his arms. So Flora already knew everything. I knew how the trust worked, I replied. I didn't know every detail of the distributions. The distinction mattered. I had respected my mother's privacy. Apparently, Ethan couldn't imagine anyone doing that. Mr. Lawson opened the binder. Since there appears to be confusion, let's review the relevant provisions. He turned several pages before stopping. The trust appoints an independent trustee. He looked toward my wife, who had remained quietly beside me throughout the meeting. My wife, Ethan interrupted. Mr. Lawson nodded. Yes. Ethan laughed. There. He pointed triumphantly. I told everyone. My wife controls everything. Mr. Lawson didn't react. You've confused 2 very different legal roles. He continued reading. The trustee is responsible for carrying out the written instructions of the trust. He paused. That does not mean the trustee owns the trust assets. Ethan's smile faded. The trustee cannot simply decide who receives the estate. No. The trustee must follow the trust exactly as written. He turned another page. The beneficiaries are separately identified. He tapped the document. The trustee has duties. The beneficiaries have rights. They are not the same thing. Around the table, heads slowly turned toward Ethan. My uncle frowned. So, being trustee doesn't mean owning $4.2 million. No, Mr. Lawson answered. It means managing the assets according to the instructions left by the person who created the trust. A cousin whispered. So Ethan misunderstood the entire thing. No one corrected him. Vanessa leaned forward. Richard. Her voice was almost a whisper. I've never actually seen any of these documents. You haven't. She slowly shook her head. Ethan said he'd already looked into everything. Every eye shifted toward him. He cleared his throat. I researched estate law. Mr. Lawson replied evenly. I can see that. The room remained silent. But research is not the same as reading the governing documents. For the first time all afternoon, Ethan had no immediate response. He looked at Vanessa, then at me, then back to the attorney. This still doesn't explain why Flora received the binder. It does, Mr. Lawson replied. Margaret wanted someone in the room who already understood the trust's administrative structure in case questions arose. I hadn't expected him to say that. Neither had anyone else. Vanessa looked at me with new eyes. You never told me Mom asked you to help. It wasn't my story to tell. She lowered her head. I know. You thought Ethan already understood everything. She gave a slow, embarrassed nod. Across the table, relatives who had been congratulating Ethan less than half an hour earlier now avoided meeting his eyes. No one asked him another question. No one looked to him for answers. Without raising my voice or defending myself, the room had changed. The documents were doing what arguments never could. They were replacing assumptions with facts. Mr. Lawson carefully closed one folder and reached for a sealed envelope tucked beneath it. Unlike the legal paperwork, this envelope had my mother's familiar handwriting across the front. He looked around the room before speaking. There is one final document your mother instructed me to read aloud after everyone understood how the trust operates. He rested his hand on the envelope. And I believe everyone is finally ready to hear it. Mr. Lawson carefully broke the seal on the envelope. No one moved. Even Ethan, who had dominated the room only minutes earlier, remained silent. The attorney unfolded the handwritten pages and smiled faintly. Your mother asked that this be read only after any questions about the trust had been addressed. He looked around the table before beginning. To my family. If you're hearing this letter, then I'm no longer here to explain my decisions myself. That is why I wanted everything written clearly. Families deserve certainty, especially during grief. The room was completely still. He continued reading. I deliberately avoided phrases like my oldest child or my eldest daughter. Those words create arguments. Names do not. Several relatives exchanged quiet glances. Every beneficiary has been identified individually because I wanted no room for assumptions or personal interpretations. Mr. Lawson paused just long enough for everyone to absorb the sentence. Then he continued. Vanessa came into my life later through remarriage. I have always loved her as my daughter, and nothing about this document changes that. But love and legal descriptions are different things. I would never allow vague language to create conflict between my daughters. Vanessa covered her mouth. Tears immediately filled her eyes. She wasn't crying because of money. She was crying because my mother had gone out of her way to protect her from exactly the misunderstanding Ethan had created. The attorney turned to the final page. The estate shall be distributed exactly according to the percentages established within this trust. My daughters are named individually. My trustee has only one responsibility, to carry out my written wishes faithfully and fairly. He lowered the letter. That concludes your mother's memorandum. No one spoke. The silence felt completely different from the one that had followed Ethan's announcement. This silence carried understanding. Vanessa slowly turned toward her husband. You told me birth order settled everything. Ethan swallowed. I believed it did. You told everyone you were certain. I misunderstood. No, she said quietly, you never bothered to find out. Those words seemed to hit him harder than anything the attorney had said. He opened his mouth, searching for another explanation. None came. My aunt was the first relative to look at me. I'm sorry, Flora. Another cousin nodded. So am I. I shouldn't have assumed the worst. One by one, the apologies came. Not because I had inherited more than anyone else. Not because I had won. But because they had allowed confidence to outweigh evidence. I shook my head. You don't owe me an apology for being confused. I glanced at the letter resting on the table. Mom spent years trying to make sure we never had to argue over any of this. Vanessa quietly wiped away a tear. I wish we'd trusted her instead of rumors. Mr. Lawson resumed his seat. With everyone's questions answered, we'll now proceed exactly as the trust instructs. And that's exactly what happened. Over the following months, every asset was distributed according to the written trust. The investment accounts remained intact until the scheduled transfers were completed. The real estate was handled according to my mother's instructions. Every beneficiary received precisely what had been planned years before her death. No one received more because they spoke louder. No one received less because they stayed quiet. My wife fulfilled her duties as trustee exactly as my mother had intended. She approved nothing based on personal opinion. She simply followed the trust. Every signature, every transfer, every instruction, exactly as written. Ethan never apologized publicly. But he also never attempted to take control again. The relatives who had once looked to him for answers stopped asking him about family finances altogether. When legal questions came up, they spoke directly with the attorney instead. His confidence had earned trust in a single afternoon. His assumptions had destroyed it just as quickly. Vanessa made a decision that surprised many of us. She insisted on reviewing every financial document herself from that point forward. I'll never sign or believe something just because someone tells me it's true again, she said. I admired her for that. She had been misled, But once the truth was in front of her, she accepted it without trying to rewrite it. Our relationship slowly healed. Grief remained. That never disappears on a schedule. But the bitterness my mother feared never took root. Months later, after the estate had been fully settled, I visited her grave alone. The autumn leaves had begun to cover the grass around her headstone. I stood there for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened in that conference room. People often believe the greatest inheritance is money. My mother left us something far more valuable. She left behind clarity. She knew memories could fade. Opinions could change. Voices could become louder than facts. So she wrote everything down. Not because she expected conflict, but because she understood human nature well enough to prepare for it. As I placed fresh flowers beside her headstone, I found myself smiling through tears. She had protected more than a $4.2 million estate. She had protected her family from the loudest lie in the room. And in the end, the truth never needed to raise its voice.